I'll get us started. Look, thank you everybody for coming, and welcome back those who were at our last session. Welcome to this session, which is looking at citizen science, community engagement and data quality in relation to squirrel gliders. And thanks very much for joining us. My name's Stuart Cowell. I'll be facilitating the session. As we start, I just want to start with an acknowledgement of country. So Biolinks is proud to acknowledge the traditional owners of the places where we all live and work, and I know we're all in various parts of the country. We recognise and respect the enduring relationship that traditional owners have with their lands and water, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future. Again, thank you all for coming along. The context of this discussion is the view that gliders represent an ideal flagship species to engage the broader community in meaningful conservation action. And the use of citizen science atlases and citizen science approaches has flourished over the last few years, and that data is informing public knowledge. How is it going to be used? What are some of the pitfalls that we might face? How can we make best use of that and encourage it, but make it valid and valuable? So today we've got a discussion with 5 practitioners, researchers, policymakers. They can identify which of those they want to belong to if they wish, but let's just say that they're all here. And we're looking at that topic of citizen science, community engagement and data quality. So we've got Lou Bull from Burrumbuttock Squirrel Glider Local Area Management Plan, Mary Bonet from Glideways, Peter Menkhorst from the Rylah Institute, Kylie Soanes from the University of Melbourne, and Jess Lawton from Connecting Country. Thanks all for coming along. Really looking forward to this. These are short and fairly focused sessions, as we all know. So we're aiming to share some ideas from the panel with everybody who's listening, but we also want to take questions from people who are listening as well. So we've got about 40 minutes to go. The way we run this is I'll lead a question to one of the folks that you can see, give them a chance to provide some guidance and some thoughts, and get some responses from other panel members here. If they want to make a comment, agree, disagree, expand, and then seeing how we're going, look at questions that might come from everybody else who's on the line. So we've got 5 questions, 5 participants, 5 questions. We'll work through each of those. We've got sort of a few minutes for each. We'll see how we're going. Because there's so many people, we're asking that you keep your camera and microphone off, because it'll just, if all 50 people try and start talking all at once, that might get a bit carried away. So please put your questions into the chat. So you should, hopefully everybody's familiar with Zoom, but on your screen you should have a little chat bubble at the bottom of your screen. Hit that and just pop your question into the chat. Make sure you're sending something to everyone. We've also got a short survey, follow-up survey with some follow-up questions, and that link has been posted in the chat. So feel free to click on that link and fill out the survey. Ideally, after we've had a conversation, either straight away after, or take it away and do it later, and I'll remind us all at the end about that. So that's our agenda for the afternoon, or for this session. So let's hop into it, and Lou, I'm going to start with you. Lucky number 1. So very straightforward question. I'm sure with a simple and clear answer. What makes a successful citizen science project? And have you got some examples that you could give us?
So I have to probably be quite honest up front. The project that I work on is not so much about the citizen science, it's actually about delivering on-ground work. And it's actually been through these previous sessions that I realised that that's an aspect of the project that is missing, really.
Okay.
So in terms of what I'm doing specifically, there's very little record keeping or citizen science. However, having said that, what is emerging is the longer I've been working in the project and in the area around Burrumbuttock in southern New South Wales, the more landholders that have come to workshops, participated in the project, the more I'm the person that is contacted, hey, I found a squirrel glider. And so I become the link, or at the moment, the repository for that information. And then being able to put that onto a database, it's a time issue. And I realise now that there's also not strong validation of what it is that they've seen. So I was just saying to Stuart before, perhaps there also needs to be scope for saying a glider was found, because we've had confirmation just in the last month of a Kef's glider in our part of the world, which was new. I didn't realise that they were going to be coming into our part of the landscape. So citizen science has played a very small part, but I can see the value of it emerging because these people who are participating in the project are obviously showing the value in being able to say, hey, I've got them, I've seen one. So that in itself, I think, is really valuable. It's a connection between the people and these animals in their part of the world.
Thanks, Lou. So maybe I'll just press you a little bit, because it's a really interesting reflection. So what is the thing that you see that is different between what you've heard about what citizen science is and what you are doing? Where do you think that gap is? Because perhaps in that gap we can also understand, what makes a successful project.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess it's that formal record keeping and where it sits. So, for example, with our project, the starting point for it was a formal population survey. I think Kylie may have even been part of that. So that formed the original basis for how to develop the project that I'm working on. So I guess it was not really a key aspect of the project to move this into that ongoing recording of these species, because the idea is that there'll be a formal follow-up monitoring event sort of 10 years on, so in 2024 for us, which will hopefully show that there's been a change over time. So citizen science was never built into it, but it's, I think, an emerging desire for the people that are involved to show their understanding and their increased knowledge of or finding of these animals. So I'm not sure if I've answered that question, but the gap was that perhaps we hadn't acknowledged that people would be keen to share their stories quite the way they are.
No, thanks, Lou. Yeah, I think that's an important part, that sort of emerging desire. Kylie, Peter, Jess, Mary, do any of you have some additional comments on this question of what makes a successful citizen science?
I think the important word in citizen science is the word science, and that has all sorts of connotations about, having a clear plan and collecting data in a methodical and consistent manner, from start to finish, and having, you're addressing a particular question. And so there's a lot of, in any science project, there's an awful lot of planning that's done, and that's absolutely critical. And so I think that's one thing to keep in mind, that if you do want to contribute useful information, you have to be quite careful and methodical about how you collect those data and how you record them. And it needs to be in a form that is actually going to prove to be useful at the end of the project. So you need to understand those requirements from the start, really.
Yep.
I would just add to that, if I could.
Please, Kylie. Yeah.
I'm interested in the idea of question-driven citizen science. So something that we're trying to do at the Cowell Research Hub is is take advantage, or take advantage is probably the wrong connotation to put on this, but enable citizen science to actually be question driven. So rather than these opportunistic biodiversity observations, which are fantastic and provide an amazing resource, can we also harness that in a way that helps us answer particular research questions? And as Peter mentioned, having it designed that way from the beginning can really help, so that you don't end up with a mass of data and then think, okay, what can we do with this? Can we direct it a little more so that we're collecting data for a purpose, and citizens are engaged in that process? They know what they're contributing to, and they know that the work they're doing is contributing to something bigger with research and ideally conservation outcomes. So that's something we've tried to do with our research app, which has a module for arboreal mammals. It's been used in Western Australia quite a lot at the moment for western ringtail possums, to try and understand how they're using the urban landscape. But we've designed that with a specific research question in mind. And a limited amount of data is collected in the app, but it's all data that goes specifically to that research question. So yeah, that's something that we're trying to harness, is the science aspect of citizen science. But I guess to the broader question of what makes citizen science successful, is both of those halves need to be given appropriate weight. I think citizens need to feel that they're getting something out of it. It can't be a one-way transaction that scientists use to quickly churn through a bunch of data that they don't want to pay a research assistant to do. How can we make sure that it's a proper relationship? I think is important, and something that I'm not sure I know how to do yet. So I'm eager to learn from others that have done that more successfully here.
Fantastic, great thoughts there. Does anyone else want to like to make any comments on that before we move on to another question? Jess?
Yeah, I think we have maybe this is blowing my own trumpet a little bit, but at Connecting Country, I think we have a really good example of a citizen science project where 10 years ago, Connecting Country wanted to set up this project. So the first thing they did was they went and spoke to a scientist to get help with their study design. So they started off with a question, and they set a large number of sites, which meant there was enough data to analyse. And then they also managed that data well, collected, as everyone's been saying, in the same way, and collected the data in a consistent way and maintained good relationships with volunteers and landholders. And then, one of the outcomes of that is that that's been analysed as part of a PhD project. So yeah, that's, I think, everything that everyone's been saying is very accurate.
Thanks. Look, I think, yeah, for all of you have highlighted that point, that there are two words in that statement, and neither of them are slave or labour. And so I think they're really important observations you've all made. Thank you. So Mary, to you. So what's the best way? Kylie started to, well, everyone's touching on it, but what's the best way to harness or use citizen science project in the context of squirrel glider conservation?
Well, I guess we're a little bit like Lou's project. We have used citizen science in sort of tandem with community engagement. So like we started off with not having very little information about gliders in our region. And so we really wanted to get as much information, find out how, if there were indeed populations of gliders, and start getting people to sort of report them and whatever. And we basically used whatever people are doing. So we didn't come in with a big plan. We have a whole range of people and groups that are wanting to help, and they all report to their own data, or it all ends up in the ALA, I guess, ultimately. But so we haven't had a good strategy. But I guess, at the same time, we have engaged the community and got them involved. And so, I think, whilst there wasn't much information about gliders, there was also very little knowledge of gliders in the community. So I guess it worked both ways. Yeah, I've sort of lost the end of the question. Sorry.
But
Yes,
just,
okay.
just
But we have, yeah. So
no,
what was,
keep going. Go on.
no, sorry. What was the other part of the question?
Or just what do you see is the best way to harness citizen science for conservation, for squirrel glider conservation? You know, how do we best pull in and use citizen science in that context?
Yeah, well, I think working in with the community engagement side of it as well.
Yeah.
Can I add to that?
Please.
Even just having just the simple mapping that I have of where gliders have been recorded when landholders have told me about them, to use that when I go on site to new landholders that we're possibly trying to engage in the project, to say, oh, you know, your neighbour recorded one, you know, a month ago, and even the stories that go with it of landholders who've been spotlighting and witnessed a glider glide down and catch a barty grub, the only barty grub catching or emerging event there was for the year, to be able to share those stories with their neighbours, it suddenly goes, oh, okay, well, okay, I'll get out and I'll have a bit more of a look. So in that sense, it creates this community of people wanting to participate at a new level or with a new interest.
A key part of that seems to me, Lou, from what you're saying, is that there's a feedback there, that it's not just a gather and send approach. There's, you know, something comes back so people can see and can connect to it. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I mean, you're always balancing a fine line when you work in small communities. You don't want to be the town gossip, but inevitably when you say, oh, a neighbour saw it, they go, oh, who was that? And so you're always balancing a fine line between a level of privacy but sharing for a greater good. And it's that feedback loop, definitely.
Terrific. So I just quickly going to the chat. Somebody's asked about the app, which Kylie, thank you very much. You've popped in there, so that's great. Yep, terrific. So some good comments there. So Jess, to you, and you talked about, you started, you know, a while ago and worked with scientists and define and so on. I mean, how do you sustain, you know, community participation in a citizen science project? And you're mute. Yeah.
Mute. There we go. Thank you. One thing that's already been mentioned and is really important is reporting back to people and showing people that their data is being used. For me, coming from kind of an academic background, it was hard for me to go, you know, how am I going to have time to do a generalized linear mixed model? But I think even just saying, hey, we recorded 10 phascogales this year and this is where they recorded, even just giving that kind of feedback can be really valuable, and then later reporting back on what your outcomes might be. And also showing people, my experience is showing people that their efforts are appreciated. So I try to take opportunities to buy people coffees or cakes or do little things like that. Even having a barbecue at the end of the year, if COVID allows us to, just as a little celebration to say thank you for your efforts. And also, I think it's good to be aware that different people are involved in these projects for different reasons. So a lot of people get involved because they want to be part of a community. And so how can we offer that? Maybe we just have to have more Zoom chats when we're in COVID because we can't meet in person, and maybe we need to make time to talk to people about their grandkids a bit more, or you know, do what we can to be able to offer that community. Some people are there because they're students and they want to learn, so how can we add to their learning experience, and just trying to be aware of those things.
So they sound like very, very much your kind of, and I don't mean this in any way as a pejorative, it's your sort of traditional community engagement tools and approaches. Is that right, do you think?
I would think so, yeah.
Anybody else on the team would like to ask or respond to that question? Otherwise, I've got a question to go to in the chat as well. So again, just to remind you, so how do we sustain community participation?
I guess I would just add, it depends on the project, but sometimes co-design from the start is really important. So if it's not something that you've handed people and said, I would like to do this for this reason, for this way, could you please help? But you go to a community and find out what their interests are, what those, you know, I think there was a comment in the chat about the diversity of reasons that people get involved. You know, if it's a co-designed process, then people are more likely to stay involved for a long time because they have ownership of it. It's not something you've handed down and are asking them to take on. And I guess the other thing is part of that feedback is making it clear. Well, I think people like to see that they're part of something bigger. You know, they're not just out there by themselves, you know, making these little records and seeing what happens. But if you can see where your records on a map sit in, you know, an Australia-wide context or that big broad context, I think, you know, it shows that you are contributing to something in a meaningful way.
Yeah, yeah. Peter, did you have a comment here?
No, just maybe reinforce two aspects. One was Jess's point and Lou's about how critical that feedback to the citizens really is to maintain enthusiasm, and we have to work hard at giving that feedback and showing people how their information that they provide is actually being used. And the other one is that if you want that information to be used in the really big decision-making processes, such as state level planning for, you know, planned fires or timber harvesting or whatever, then the data has to eventually make its way into the state government wildlife databases. And it's the proliferation of apps that people are using to collect information is wonderful, and it gives everybody a chance to contribute. And they're, on the whole, they're much less clunky than the VBA in Victoria is. But it's a little daunting for those of us in Melbourne who are trying to collate all this information into the VBA to even know what people are doing out there, and which, you know, the vast number of different apps that people are putting information into these days. So I think we need to get somehow get better coordination so we can try and improve the capture of those records so they can be useful in the big issues of state government planning and local government planning and so on.
Yeah. That is a tremendous segue, and also picks up well on a question. Bertram, in the question, just asked what online platforms do people use to share information? You know, would it be feasible to set up an online project that could document and share citizen science, you know, in gliders? So that, perhaps you could touch on that, Peter, in terms of this question about where projects currently record and report data, which you've started to talk to, and what are the pros and cons of those different things, which again you've started to talk to. So if you could expand more on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, I started out in the early 1980s establishing the Atlas of Victorian Mammals, as it was called then, and it kind of was inspired by the Australian Bird Atlas project that the REAU carried out. And so I've been involved in the Victorian Mammal Database, the state government's mammal database, for 35 years or something. And originally, you know, there was one database. Well, there were kind of two, one at the museum and one in what was in the Fisheries and Wildlife Department. And those two departments could work together and come up with a combined database of Victorian mammal records, all species, marine and terrestrial. And, you know, we've tried to maintain that over the years, and it's expanded, in fact, to the biodiversity atlas, so it includes plants as well as vertebrates and invertebrates. So it's a massive database now with many millions of records. And with, even though there may have only been 17 Squirrel Glider records in the last 10 years, as Ross pointed out in the last session, that's probably quite true. And it's very concerning because we know that there have been lots more than 17 Squirrel Gliders seen in the last 10 years, heaps more. But that information is not finding its way into the VBA for a whole variety of reasons. And we're keen to try and overcome that. And I think the way that has to be done is that the DELWP has to get better at tapping into all the other sites where information is being recorded, because the world's moved on at a very rapid pace with all these recording apps such as the iNaturalist platform and the things like Dylan spoke about, the Albury Wodonga app that the local government has set up there. And there's a whole lot of apps specific to particular groups of mammals. There's an echidna one and a platypus one and so on. So really, I think that citizen science groups should use the app that they find best suits their needs and is, user-friendly and available freely and readily. But it's really up to probably, I guess, the government agencies to work out a process for ensuring that records collected on that range of different apps find their way into the VBA. It's quite complex because there's real potential to end up with duplicated records, which are a nightmare to try and get rid of. So it's a difficult issue actually, but I certainly don't want those difficulties that public servants face in the Melbourne head office to get in the way of great work that people such as yourselves are doing out there in the regions. And I encourage everybody to contribute where they can to citizen science projects, get involved, and just as long as I said at the start, as long as those records are being recorded in a consistent and meaningful way, we can work out later how to get them into the databases where they'll contribute to overall statewide planning and priority setting, wildlife management of all sorts.
So I think that, it reinforces that to a general point, perhaps about what you've talked about, the citizen side, of course, about being friendly and accessible, but also the science side, which is the design. These things need to be designed in such a way that it's meaningful, and part of that meaning is about being able to connect to those broader processes that it's trying to influence.
Yes.
Terrific.
There, I'm really only talking about to a large extent, I'm talking about the locality records as much as anything. And so a place, a time, a place, and maybe some habitat information they're the most important element that we're interested in. And then, of course, the citizen science groups can collect a whole lot of extra information on top of that. We would like the capacity to strip off those three elements of date, place, and some kind of habitat information.
Yeah.
If that's possible and agreeable.
Or maybe that can form part of a conversation. It's just whatever the app is, whatever the structure is, it has those things, and then whatever it is.
Yeah, it has to have those three things to be useful to us, really.
Yeah. We've got a question in the chat which I'd like to come to, but I'd like it as I'm going to hang on to it as a closing question, so I will come back to it. I'm going to go to you, Kylie, on just thinking about, and a couple of questions have asked us about methods and tech and things that can be used for citizen science. So what do you think are the appropriate is there a boundary around appropriateness? Are there appropriate rules and methods and inappropriate ones? Or
I mean, I think if you want to draw a hard boundary, it has to be around animal ethics. Your citizen science project can't be about people scaling trees and peeking into hollows willy-nilly. So there's sort of a line there, but that's generally not the core of what citizen science is. It normally involves generally passive or remote sensed information. So things like cameras, I think someone mentioned in the chat. There are a lot of ways that we can learn about species without having to physically wrangle them anymore. So there was another question about the proliferation of apps, and are there too many apps? And I think it's common. I don't know which one I'm supposed to be. Do I use BirdLife or do I use iNaturalist, or what's the right app to use? But as Peter said, it comes down to the reason that you're using it. So if you're working as part of a specific question, it makes sense that someone has designed an app for that question that you can then use to go out and be part of that project. I agree that all the records, especially locality records, should all go to a central location so that information can be useful beyond your research project. But I don't actually have a problem with there being a lot of different projects. It's the same as having a different data collection sheet for every specific project that you're using. It's just computerized nowadays. So just making sure that, I guess, if you're designing apps, that it's something that's not duplicating an existing effort, and it's targeted to your questions, and it's user friendly, and people actually want to engage with it. The other method that I quite like is cameras, mostly because I'm sitting on probably 10,000 camera trap images of squirrel gliders going across rope bridges that I do not have time to go through, and I would love to know what's on them. So there are online platforms now where researchers upload camera trap images, and engaged people who want to sit at home and flick through and see what wildlife we're up to can go through them and be part of that process. So it's something I haven't used before, but I think I'd like to get involved with. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways. I don't think there's a best method. I think the best method is always about the question, I guess.
Yeah. Lou, Mary, Jess, Peter, any comments on that?
Yeah, could I just comment that, I mean, I guess we use, we're working at, quite a local scale. And so, I guess we work with whatever people are comfortable with in terms of apps. People are already using Canberra Nature Map, or like the Albury, same thing, the Albury Nature Map. Or they want to share in little closed groups. So we use like Facebook groups or WhatsApp groups and, things like that. So I think, at this, I mean, ultimately, we want the data to go to the ALA or the equivalent in New South Wales. But, it's also about, it's our local projects, it's about the people that are involved in it. We want to be sharing, in a way that is accessible for them, and that that they feel comfortable using. So, I think there's different scales to doing these citizen science projects. I mean, my regret is that we didn't. We were actually going to engage Nature Mapper from the start in our project, and we got very close. And then at that time, it wasn't translating to ALA, so we didn't. So yeah, but I think it's something that would be good if it was all in one place. Thanks,
Mary. I'm hearing from you all if I'm hearing correctly, various reinforcements of it's about the design and really putting time and effort into those questions of design, not just the why, but how we're going to do it, and how far do we want that data to go? Maybe it is just for local purpose, so some of those broader connections aren't so necessary, and so on. So, putting time into design sounds like a fairly critical point from all of you. Would that be a fair observation, do you think? Terrific. So I'm going to go to this question from Kylie Durant. So Kylie just says, I love citizen science. Some of you might have seen the question. I love the engagement it makes happen and information it gives to create projects and activities. But at what point are the agencies responsible for threatened species management outsourcing a fundamental responsibility? So it's this question of, are we kind of offsetting what otherwise might need to happen at an agency level? So, practitioners are being asked to show outcomes in shorter and shorter periods of time with less and less amounts of resources. Can citizen science possibly fill that gap? So a big and fundamental question about the role of citizen science. So Lou, do you have a thought?
I do, and I think probably Kylie and I are on a similar page, delivering projects for threatened species, and the monitoring expectation that is put on a project when you're delivering it can be really challenging. So it's trying to deliver on the outcomes for a threatened species when really what we're delivering is a fairly short-term project, and the reality is we can only really monitor the stuff that we're delivering, not the longer term outcomes of a threatened species. Yet we're being asked to set up and implement or execute some of that monitoring. So it I think puts just a huge added layer of probably offloaded stress, perhaps. Sorry, I'm speaking maybe out of term here, but I certainly personally have felt that with the project. Going, well, we and I can deliver so much, but working on a threatened species to look at that longer term, the longer term outcomes of what we're trying to achieve is beyond what we actually have funding for. So, yep, I endorse what Kylie's saying. And it takes time. I'm sitting here delivering an on-ground project and thinking suddenly I haven't gone down that track of citizen science because we haven't set it up for that. So there's a big gap there.
Yeah. Jess, you got thoughts about that question?
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I mean, so my role is monitoring, and I just do monitoring, but I do sympathise with this idea that you might have a short-term project, and then your funders always ask you, how is this project going to keep going after we give you this small amount of funding, and that's really frustrating because you need funding to run the project. So yeah, I think that it feels like people expect that citizen science projects might deliver a lot for free sometimes, or for very little money, and you just have to do, you can only do so much, I think. So yeah, that's my comment.
Yeah. So where does citizen science then sit in that conversation? Because it seems to me there's an aspiration for citizen science to be impactful, but a reality in the responses you've just made of the understanding of the temporal nature of being able to demonstrate impact. So how do we balance those two things? I'm happy for anybody to have a swing at that.
It's
you go, Peter.
You go.
It's something we've tried to do, working with various community groups in partnership before. I think some of them are probably in this room, in using long-term citizen science programs to monitor species trends. It's not necessarily about research or finding out something new. It's literally just keeping an eye on these species in a rural peri-urban landscape. And we put a lot of work into trying to develop a program from the outset that would last more than 10 years and be amenable to change as funding came in and went, in the trickling nature that it tends to do. But the reality is there's never the appetite or the funding for monitoring that you would like there to be. And citizen science can be a powerful stopgap. We shouldn't have to rely on citizen science. I agree. That shouldn't be the way that it is. But I think it can be if done really well and really well thought out. And I think up in Burrumbuttock, they're doing some great work trying to do that.
Yep. Peter?
Just acknowledge what Lou said, and I fully understand that expecting little community groups to monitor the Squirrel Glider is a terribly big ask. And, you know, as we heard in the previous section, people like, you know, Ross Goldingay, a professor, has spent 30 years working out how to monitor Squirrel Gliders. And yeah, I think sometimes our expectations are probably way too high when granting bodies give money to community groups and say, you know, restore the habitat and then monitor the impact of that. I mean, professional scientists struggle to do that. We really need to temper our expectations and make sure that we're asking people to do things that are actually achievable.
Yep, yep. Thanks. But I think it's a really important observation, and yeah, perhaps also reflecting on Kylie on your point. Perhaps sometimes the citizen science element needs to sit independently of the short-term funding project. They're actually two different questions.
Absolutely, yeah.
In terms of those long-term things, and you're the experts in the space, so feel free to howl me down with derisive laughter. But it seems to me that the Bird Atlas represents a very long-term, you know, citizen science project that is incredibly influential. So there is an example. It's a scale question, but
there is. I mean, the bird world has really taken this to incredible lengths in the last couple of decades, and you know, eBird is now a worldwide citizen science monitoring project that gathers vast amounts of information. But you know, birds are relatively easy to identify, and lots of people are interested in birds.
Yeah,
gliding possums are an order of magnitude more difficult. I think
yes.
We need to keep that in the back of our mind.
Yeah.
Understood. One last quick question, just to pick up, and I'd call it a technical question that maybe one of you will be able to answer quickly or take offline. It's Tandy has asked what are the costs involved in getting a citizen science app developed for a project? Has anyone got experience with that? And
for me, it's about, I don't know, 20 dozen more grey hairs than I had when I started. I think just, yeah, it can be really tricky. But I think there are lots of different platforms now that are simpler to engage with. I don't have an idea about cost. I just know that arguing with the app developer about what should be in the app took a lot more time than I would have liked it to take. So just be aware of those aspects. Have a really clear idea of what you want when you go into the project, so that you don't get handed back a pre-formed app that doesn't suit the needs.
No, fantastic. Look, and we're at 3 o'clock. I want to thank you all for some really clear-eyed and good constructive observations about citizen science. It's clearly an important space, and does have lots of value, but needs to be done in a way that is you know, well thought out, well structured, and clear. And I think you've all given that advice and made those observations very well. I just want to remind everybody that we've got some follow-up questions in the survey that has just been reposted in the chat. So please go to that, give us your thoughts. They'll be collated. This will be used and you know, used to inform what Biolinks you know, does in this space. So again, thank you all for your participation. Thanks everybody on the line for listening and contributing. Some great comments in the chat. And yeah, those of you who are coming to the next session, look forward to seeing you there. Otherwise, thanks very much and have a good afternoon.